I am Matthew Schmidt, president at Dzone, and we are here today to talk about the state of DevOps and the trends that we're seeing through our research at Dzone.com and what developers are telling us about the tools that they're using and the methods and the changes that the industry is going through with respect to DevOps and continuous delivery and how microservices and containers are affecting all of that. Well, moving on. All right. So as I said, I'm Matt Schmidt, president at Dzone. I'm a developer, an architect, an entrepreneur. Dzone is a portal for developers focused on delivering technical content to help developers do their jobs better. We publish most of our content focused on 13 different portals around different topics like Java or DevOps or security or artificial intelligence. We also sell and build a product called Answer Hub. You can see more at our booth outside of this room, focused on delivering developer communities and tools for developer relations professionals. So a little bit about the data that was used to gather this research and the different surveys that we use. This is a combination of a couple of different surveys focused around continuous delivery, DevOps, containers, microservices. Over 1,500 different people participated in these two surveys, and the data was collected across a couple of different dates near the end of 2016 and early 2017. A little bit about our audience so that you guys know who it is that were participating in these surveys. Our audience tends to trend towards the more experienced developer, having an average of 15 years of experience in the software field. 18% of these developers come from organizations with 10,000 or more employees. So they're trending towards larger organizations, more experienced developers. And in these two surveys, 45% of the respondents came from Europe, with 30% coming from Europe, or from the US. So larger organizations, more experienced developers coming from the US and Europe as the participants. Additionally, 83% of the respondents for our containers research guide are working on web applications or services. So really focused on delivering product to consumers or to other businesses directly to the customers through these types of applications. So let's dive right into the actual research and some of the findings. So the first thing that we found is that 58% of the organizations taking our research don't have a dedicated DevOps team. So for the most part, these organizations are relying on their existing development teams or their IT teams to fill a DevOps role. Now, those that are using dedicated DevOps teams are kind of trending towards larger organizations and are also using them to push tool adoption inside the org, to help adjust the software development lifecycle to adapt to the changing needs that DevOps brings inside the organization. And size does matter for this. So more than half of the respondents at large companies are using a dedicated DevOps team. And so while the majority of these respondents are not having a dedicated team, when they're coming from a large organization, they are using a dedicated team. This probably helps to have clear accountability, to help break down the walls, and to deal with the communication issues that arise between groups inside larger organizations. And one of the things that we found across most of the research is that one of the key tenets of this adoption of DevOps and of continuous delivery is communication. So breaking down the barriers between different groups and between the development organizations and the IT organizations is pretty key to the adoption of DevOps inside of an organization. More specifically, when you look at continuous delivery trends, and really that's the sort of El Dorado, the holy grail of development is that you have a push button or an automated deploy to your production environments, to your staging environments, to your testing, to dev. What we're seeing is that most of the organizations that are trying to get towards continuous delivery are larger organizations. Only 41% of organizations with less than 100 employees talk about continuous delivery as a priority. Right? So most of the organizations that are trying to focus on continuous delivery and have that be a an accelerator for their business are trending towards these larger organizations. And the main barrier to adopting continuous delivery and DevOps as a whole remains corporate culture and lack of time. Right? Even in our own small organization, fitting in the creation of new infrastructure, the changing of processes always takes a back seat to being able to firefight and to be able to do our day-to-day jobs. And so, I think it takes a lot to get the corporate culture to adjust, to adapt to being focused on continuous delivery, on DevOps, and on making sure that the people who are tasked with implementing this corporate change are given enough time to be able to do that. And so most of the respondents that we talked to said lack of time is the major impediment to being able to roll out DevOps or continuous delivery inside their organization. Nearly 80% of our respondents said that the development org is the one driving the change towards having DevOps inside the organization or for having continuous delivery. So the developers want to get their code in the hands of their customers, in the hands of their users more quickly, and they see that DevOps and continuous delivery are ways to make that happen. And so most of the change is being driven by the development orgs. Now, this doesn't mean that they want to be on the monthly rotation for when things go wrong or to be responsible for handling the alerts. But they do want to try to be the driver of change inside the organization and make sure that their code gets out there faster. Now, 52% of our respondents said that management is helping them get there, is helping be the driver, the enabler for the cultural change that needs to happen. This seems like a very positive change. It's up from the year before. Now, unfortunately, 17% of the respondents said that their management actually inhibits a DevOps culture. Now, we didn't dig into this very much, but I wonder whether this has to do more with organizations in certain verticals or of certain company sizes. But how many of you guys feel like your management is an enabler of DevOps and the principles that it entails? So a little more maybe than 52%, but how many feel like you're being held back from being able to make the changes that need to happen? More than in the last talk. So in the last time I gave this talk, there was one particular group that was saying that their management was very much against the changes that need to happen. Now, of course, they were still using CVS for version control, so I think that they have some other problems they maybe need to get through first, but management may not be their problem. Another thing that we found is that developers are deploying to production. Now, I thought about putting a little meme up here of everything burning down, but developers are saying that 40% of the respondents are tasked with deploying to production. Now, this means they're taking things all the way from building to testing to staging to production. In other organizations, we're seeing that operation teams and release engineers are also responsible for deployment. But the companies that are embracing developers deploying are also making heavy use of a consistent set of tools across the software development lifecycle and across their environments. So they're going to have the same set of tools and the same setup in their dev environments, in their QA environments, in their production. Another 18% are saying that they're using the same tools for dev and QA, but have a different environment and a different setup for production. And this will probably change as we move forward and as the adoption of containers makes the replication of environments much, much easier. But for the moment, we see that there are still about 18% of the people who have development and QA, but not production set up the same way. A consequence of developers being responsible for deploying is that they're happening more frequently. So 20% or 25% are deploying many times a day. So they're pushing new code pretty frequently to their users, to their customers, getting them out in front of people, making changes that are having a positive or negative impact on their customers. 15% another 15% are reported to be deploying at least once a day. And another 30% are deploying weekly. So there's a lot of changes that are happening to these code bases. A strong majority of our respondents are producing new features and improvements to their products every week. And customers are getting new code in hours or days instead of months, like we might have seen in years past. Now, an important consequence of this is that we need to understand how long it takes to recover from failure. So if developers and IT teams are deploying to their production environments multiple times per day or even weekly, we need to know that the mean time for recovery for most setups is 19 hours. Now, that may seem like a lot of time if you try to understand that most people are seeing at least 10% of their deploys fail. And so then they need to have recovery times. And these are happening in taking about 19 hours. Now, those that are using containers see a 20% improvement in their recovery time. And companies that are using microservices see the best recovery time, taking about 7 hours as a mean time to recovery. Now, failure here and recovery are focused more around complete downtime. So your whole infrastructure has died, everything is gone, you have to be able to bring it back up. And that's partly why, when you're using the microservices architectures, you don't run into quite the same problems because only a piece of your infrastructure may fail as you have when you deploy new code. Now, an interesting aside and somewhat scary, 27% of the developers that we surveyed didn't know how long it takes to restore service when there's a failure. So there continues to be a disconnect in the information flow between the production environments and the developers that are supposedly tasked with deploying there. So 37% of the teams that are deploying code experience failures daily. So while we're deploying more often, we're also seeing more failures and learning to recover from those failures. Now, what I'd be interested in seeing, and part of the next round of research that I hope we'll do, is are we testing more and creating failures during the testing process so that we can learn from these, incorporate the data that we're getting, and improve our recovery times. Now, in the research that we did, the recovery times are improving year over year, but it does seem like 19 hours is still pretty heavy when we're talking about 37% of teams experiencing these failures daily. Now, one of the benefits of DevOps is that one of the big improvements that we get is that we're able to roll back these builds, and particularly in a continuous delivery pipeline. 45% of respondents reported that they rolled back or hotfixed 10% of their deployments. 20% rolled back 20%, and 13.5% rolled back 30% of their deployments. So, and even further, 7.6% had to roll back half of their deployments. So there are a lot of deployments happening, and there's a lot of failure happening. And this probably points to a lack of testing, as we'll see in the next slide, that while we're getting to the point of developers making their code available more quickly, we're seeing failures, and our processes aren't catching those failures early enough in the build cycle. We'll talk about the slide I just showed where there were that many failures every time there's a build. Part of this could be that 20% of the respondents said they have no tests that were automated as part of their CD pipeline. Now, this may be that they're largely focused on manual testing and moving through the different pipelines by the click of somebody in QA or a developer, an IT, or release manager. But that's still a lot of deploys and a lot of builds happening without any automated tests as part of the deployment lifecycle. Still, quality is an important part of the DevOps process. Now, while there may be builds that are running without tests, there is data to be gathered as part of the process. And while we're running automated tests and we're running integration tests, and one of the key things that we're trying to gather during the CD lifecycle and the deployment process is that developers are running code quality reviews. they're doing code reviews, they're running code coverage, they're doing all of these as part of the pipeline. So while there may not be any automated tests per se, there are steps within the CD pipeline that are focused on trying to make sure that there is quality as part of the deliverable. But with some of the data that we've captured, most of these organizations are not being data-driven. 30% of the respondents are saying that they don't use metrics to measure how effectively they're using their CI or their CD processes as part of their development lifecycle. So there's a lot of data to be gathered, but they're not actually looking at it, not capturing it. For those that are using metrics and data, the 50% are measuring build times, while 40% are measuring the number of bugs, and 25% are measuring broken build time. So interestingly, only 15% measured the downtime during a deployment as a metric for how successful their continuous delivery pipeline is. One of the biggest pain points that we heard from developers during the survey with implementing CD, with implementing DevOps, is that environment configuration and setup are the biggest pain points. And this is a big place where containers are starting to have an impact. And we're seeing that as you build out your new infrastructure, as we get rid of the process of, well, it works on my machine and not in production or not in staging or dev. And containers are helping to give us a consistent set of implementation details of infrastructure that help us reduce the number of problems with that inconsistency. So Docker is by far the most used container technology. 92% of developers who are using containers report using Docker, but the field is wide open in terms of the orchestration of your containers or the operating system that you're using to host your containers. So what we found is that 35% of the developers are using Kubernetes, 32% are using Docker Swarm, 26% are using Amazon ECS, and on the operating side, 25% of the respondents are using CoreOS for their operating system to help host the containers. Now, you can probably hear and find out more about most of these technologies at this show as they're all open source. I think CoreOS even has a booth downstairs. But that is one of the things we are seeing, is that the field is wide open. And while a great deal of companies are using containers, less than 50% of the company's workloads are orchestrated, and most companies have less than 100 containers deployed. So I think developers are using containers to help make their job easier, to try out new tools, but the process of getting containers into production workflows is still lagging a bit behind the early part of the software development lifecycle. And frankly, automation of the lifecycle has not arrived yet. So what we have found is that 60% of organizations say they have not achieved full automation or push-button deploys for any version of their software. So there's still a lot of work to be done across the organization to not just automate, but even to make push-button movement through the continuous delivery pipeline. Now, it is quite amazing that 40% of the respondents say they have achieved full automation of their product that allows them to push-button any version of their software to any environment in their setup. Now, I know that we're still in the early days of trying to achieve this even at Dzone, but I can speak to the work that it takes to get there and the difficulties that we've run into as we've tried to be able to build and deploy any version of Dzone and of AnswerHub to our infrastructure. What we found here is that infrastructure as code is not in place. And so when we speak of infrastructure as code, what we're talking about is being able to write your description of your infrastructure and the steps that it takes to create that in a declarative way and store that in a version-controlled place so that we're able to create and maintain and manage our infrastructure just as if we were maintaining our code and the rest of our database schema. What we have found is that most organizations are not using infrastructure as a code. So whether they're using containers or not, they're setting up their infrastructure separately from their coding process, from the rest of their software development lifecycle, and making that not be as managed as it could be. Now, when organizations are capturing their infrastructure changes in version control, it seems that the respondents are split pretty evenly on whether or not they use changes to the infrastructure as code files to trigger a new deployment. So it still seems, as back to the automation piece, that there is still a lot of manual happening, even as we transition to DevOps and transition to continuous delivery. One of the changes, and probably a side effect of computers getting faster and the cloud being available for building, is that builds are happening very fast these days. 61% finish in less than 10 minutes. Long gone are the days where it takes hours or days to build software. So while 61% finish in under 10 minutes, an additional 17% finish in under 30. So the vast majority of the builds are happening in just a few minutes and allowing developers to compile their code, to push it to their testing environments, and even to get it to production in a very quick fashion. From a continuous integration perspective, and as part of moving towards continuous delivery, Jenkins is ruling the roost in that respect. So we're seeing that most developers are using Jenkins. It had about 66% of the respondents. Behind that, the next closest choice is that you actually don't use a continuous integration tool. So it does seem that there's a lot of adoption for not just continuous integration, but also for continuous delivery. And if you're using something else besides Jenkins, I'd love to hear about it after the talk. From a source control perspective, GitHub and Git are dominating here, not just from using the hosted version of GitHub, but also the enterprise version of GitHub. With 40% using the hosted version and another 11% using the enterprise version. Surprisingly, we had a new rising star in this survey this year with GitLab making some serious inroads, taking 23% of the respondents. So I don't know, how many people are using GitLab? All right, that's pretty, little more than 23%, I think. So a lot of movement in the GitLab camp this year. Interesting, another 11% of the respondents are using Subversion and wrote that into the survey because we didn't include it. So with all this talk about cloud and the movement to cloud and how the Google and Amazon and Microsoft want you to run all your workloads in the cloud, from AI to your continuous delivery processes, 37% of developers still prefer or are required to deploy on-premise and rack their own servers or build their own virtualization technologies. So how many people still have to deploy in their own data centers? A little less than 37% here. So it was an interesting stat, and I think that probably relates to the use of government technologies and people who have to deal with stricter security requirements. But cloud is still far and away the most common deployment platform, but there is still a strong group of developers that have to deploy to hardware. And last but not least, developers have to keep learning. So one of the things we found is that developers are constantly taking courses to increase their skills. They're visiting sites like Dzone to get better at their job. Over 50% of the respondents said that they take an online class or training to stay up to date on new technologies and get crash courses. And 75% of them said that they read sites like Dzone and others to keep up with the latest goings on in the new technologies that are part of their job as a developer. All right. And that's all I have for the data, and I'll open it up for questions. No questions. Let's see, I think we had a couple of options from JetBrains, I believe, has a tool. Amazon has a couple of options. In fact, those are some that we're evaluating right now. There are a couple of more expensive options, but I don't recall if they were on the list. And what for CD? Okay. GitLab has a CI/CD bundle as well. Okay, are you using that just for CI or for both? Yeah, so those that are using containers are using Docker. Those that are trying to orchestrate a set of containers are using tools like Kubernetes or Amazon ECS. So if they're using the 32% that are using Kubernetes are obviously using Docker, but they're largely, so that's the split, right? It's not that they're using Kubernetes for the containers; they're using Kubernetes to orchestrate the set of containers that they're running and the workloads.
Did you happen to ask any questions about virtualization and what the devs are using virtualization?
I don't recall, but I can check, and if you give me your card afterwards, I'll get in touch.
Do you have any information about what classes are being used on top of Kubernetes?
We did capture that, but I don't recall off the top of my head which ones. But we did capture some. I think that the biggest one is that they're not using a pass on top of for that.
The company that I work for and prior employers, they separate DevOps and engineering into two groups. We have DevOps provisioning, TPCs and EC2 instances.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see this typical siloing of engineering from DevOps, or do you see them merging?
So I think that kind of speaks to one of the slides that I was talking about, where the emphasis of DevOps is coming from the development organization wanting more control over the entire software development lifecycle, including deploying to production. So I think I see it more like happening in an integrated role rather than a separation of concerns like what you're seeing. Now, it'd be interesting to see if there's more data that we could capture that would illustrate that kind of split. Is the DevOps team completely separate from engineering? And
yeah, there's a separate infrastructure team that does DevOps oriented provisioning of resources. One of the main ones that we've had is serverless technology, like AWS Lambda.
mm-hmm.
And people in engineering need more access to be able to do a rapid turnaround of Lambda deployments and things that nature, but that being more of infrastructure as code.
Right.
And you see more of an infrastructure role. So do you see,
So who gets to deploy that inside your org right now?
right now engineering is doing it, but much to the chagrin of DevOps folks. So do you see serverless technology as being a new wrinkle that organizations need to figure out where it fits?
I think serverless technology is great for engineering teams being able to do more with less. So, anytime that we can cut down on the footprint of the infrastructure is probably good for an org. It makes things more secure. It allows the teams to iterate more quickly. So I continue to see that integration of the two, giving as long as there's oversight within the organization to have checkpoints and audits for security and compliance concerns. But I think that a big part of that we found as part of this research is that when the dev and the ops teams are still separate, that communication is part of what's making this whole DevOps thing work for them. So I don't know how it works inside your org. If there's a high bandwidth communication or if the dev team is always waiting on the DevOps team, and vice versa.
Not very happy.
They're part of, you can get most of them as part of our, the 2 DevOps, so the Continuous Delivery Research Guide, and also the Containers Research Guide, both that we released this year. So you can get most of the highlights there, but I'd be happy to send you the report as well. We send the results of the surveys to everybody that takes the surveys as well. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.